I started working with black bears about 25 years ago and came at it from rather an unusual angle. I graduated from actually Hanover High School in 1970 and then UNH in 1974 with a bachelor's degree in wildlife and hope to go on to graduate school to do the kind of work I'm doing today. Unfortunately, I'm dyslexic and my grade scores and test scores were below par and I failed to get into graduate school. As a result, I went west to a trade school and learned the art of gunsmithing and employed myself as a custom gunsmith and gun designer over 30 years. I met my wife, Debbie. I have no idea where she is. She's probably out still selling books at Colt Firearms, where we both worked in the product engineering department. And in 1982, we returned to New Hampshire, and I still had it in my mind I wanted to do the kind of work I wanted to do. I had a leg up on this because my father, Lawrence Kilham, who was a virologist at the Dartmouth Medical School, studied birds as an avocation. So I grew up in a household with lots of wild animals around. When I was 2, my dad went on sabbatical to Africa and brought a half-grown leopard into the house, much to my mother's chagrin. My younger sister, Phoebe, was 1 at the time. She currently helps me with the bears, and my next oldest brother, Josh, was 4. He woke up one night with the leopard at the end of his bed screaming. Josh was screaming, not the leopard. Needless to say, we all survived and returned from Africa with 2 African hornbills and a Nile crocodile that my dad raised in a basement shower until it was 6 feet long and the National Zoo came and took it away. In 1961, we came to Lyme when I was 9 years old, and my dad continued his work with wildlife. He had woodpeckers and aviaries, hawks and owls, crows and ravens. There was a beaver in the kitchen that leveled the floors and dammed up the toilet. He had a porcupine in a greenhouse next to his study. So I had an exposure to lots of wild animals. And my dad studied birds. He wrote the life histories of the woodpeckers of the eastern United States, as well as a book on crows and ravens. And when my time came along, I was interested in carnivores. My dad prided himself on simple apparatus. He had a pair of binoculars and a small folding chair. He and my mother would take turns sitting in front of woodpecker nests documenting courtship and behavior. But I had to come up with a different plan. All of you have been in the forest, and if you're lucky enough to get a glimpse of a carnivore, they disappear rapidly into the brush, and there's not much opportunity to study their behavior. But based on my childhood experience, I realized I could raise an orphan animal loose in the forest, untethered, document its juvenile behavior, and use that to understand its adult behavior. I wasn't thinking about black bears because at the time there was limited amount of black bear rehab in New England. I was thinking more along the lines of a bobcat or a coyote or the fisher, the large woodland weasel we have. And it turns out that black bears landed in my lap. They turned out to be the ideal animal to study. They had a long juvenile period, and they followed me easily in the forest. A year ago, we started the Yearling Bear Center to become hopefully lasting into the future. Even though I've been doing bears for 25 years, we became formal. We're now a nonprofit. You can go to our website, which is yearlingbearcenter.org, if you want more information. Hopefully, we'll be able to get somebody to start taking our places and help me with my research. I still have I got my PhD 3 years ago at Drexel University. I'm replacing body parts at this point, and we could have some younger people coming in learning what I'm up to. And also our facilities are in the process of being upgraded. Last winter, we get very young cubs like these guys. That come to us when their dens are disrupted in the winter. They're often logging situations where the loggers leave bunches of wood in the woods when the woods get wet in the fall and come back and retrieve them in the wintertime. By that time, the bears have moved in for a den and the cubs get abandoned. Or they're in new building development where they build big brush piles and burn them in the wintertime. And by the time they go to burn them, the bears have moved in to make dens. And so we get these quite often. We raise our cubs in we have an 8-acre and a 10-acre forested enclosure. These enclosures have escape trees, which these cubs are up. There's 12 bears in that picture. There's an oak stand, a wetland, small ponds. So the bears have exposure to natural foods that are growing in the environment. And there are also wild bears on the outside of the fence. So they're interacting positively and negatively with the wild bears on the outside. We get bears that don't put on enough fat and wake up in the middle of winter. This bear should have been a 40-pound bear, but when it came in, it was badly frostbitten. It weighed 15 pounds. We had to give it subcutaneous fluids for a week before it even eat, and once it started eating, it thrived, and we released it weighing over 45 pounds that spring. So it's been very successful with most of these bears. This last winter, we had an extraordinary number of bears. Last fall, there was no natural food in the woods, no acorns, no beech nuts, no apples. And the result of that was all the cubs that got orphaned, regardless of why they got orphaned, whether it was the hunting season or not, all ended up in residential areas. We picked up cubs in probably 50% of the towns in New Hampshire had cubs. We ended up with 82 cubs before the winter was over. And our facility was overcrowded. They asked us how many cubs we could take, and we had no idea. We never tried. And fortunately, my study of black bears has shown that these bears are able to make friends with strangers. And these cubs would be coming in 2 or 3 at a time, frightened and running off scared into the corners. But within a week, they were wrestling with another bear, and 2 weeks, they were sleeping with another bear. And so the cage is not very big. It's 24 by 32 with a 16-foot ceiling. Bears like to be up. My sister Phoebe would feed them and bed them, and then they would ask her to leave. We had remote cameras so we could monitor what was going on. And once she was gone, the bears would come down and play. But the big problem was that took up all of our facility. And then spring came, and more bears started coming. On April 1st, I got a 2-pound cub. It was an abandonment cub. A mom had run out of milk and left it. Came from Shelburne, New Hampshire. There was 3-foot snowbanks up there when they spotted it. And I had to nurse it with a syringe with a nipple on the end of it, and finally when it's big enough and it got warm outside, I took it for its first walk, and here it is weighing about 6 pounds. These cubs that don't have experience with their mother in the forest need to get that experience. They have within them all the knowledge that they need, but they have to be exposed to a complex environment. So getting them out and walking them as early as possible is important. My interest in bears has been in the behavior of bears, especially the social behavior of bears. In this chart you won't be able to read, but you'll see that it's rather complex, and the pictures around it are pictures of bears doing what I describe on the chart. And it's kind of like this talk tonight. It'll be illustrated with photographs and video, and I'll speak about the behaviors involved. And when I started doing black bear research, they were considered to be solitary animals. That is, the only interaction they had with their kind was with their mates, their cubs, and they knew they congregated at concentrated food sources, but beyond that they didn't know very much about them. And what I found is they're actually quite social animals. They're not social like a group of chimpanzees or a pack of wolves that have fixed territories and alpha animals that allocate resources down through the family group. Bears are social like we are. The female bears have home ranges, which are high-quality areas to raise their cubs in. They're relatively territorial, and these home ranges are evenly spaced on the landscape. The foods they eat are the highest quality foods in the forest, the nuts, berries, and insects that are generally available in stands, and these stands are unevenly dispersed in the landscape. These crops are affected by seasonal changes, droughts and frosts and so forth. So at any given time, one female may have a huge surplus of food in her home range and her immediate neighbor could have nothing. And this has led to a system of sharing over time that mirrors human social behavior. These female bears are reciprocal altruists, and what that means is that's a tit for a tat with a time delay. So if your neighbor invites you over for dinner, you feel obligated to invite them back over for dinner. You're not doing that because you're nice, you're doing that because it's in you. You were born that way. And the bears are born the same way. Robert Trivers in 1971 wrote a paper about human reciprocal altruism. He listed a number of psychological conditions that go along with it that include friendship, gratitude, moralistic aggression, and a number of other ones, and the bears have all those. So the bears are the only non-human animal that exhibit the same type of social behavior that we do. They look for this in the great apes, and the great apes all had other types of social behavior. Most of them were group social. So we have an opportunity to learn from the black bear about our own past. And it's a past that we know very little about. We have a fossil record of our ancestors, but we have no behavioral record of what we were. And we have a chance to learn that from the bears. I took my study animals. I used the bears that were bottle fed, that were dependent on me and had no experience in the forest. I figured they could use the experience and I could use it myself. So I took them for long walks in the forest up to 9 hours at a time and returned them safely to a remote enclosure. I was able to observe their very first reaction to their natural environment. I could see their tongues coming out in an exaggerated fashion, sticking to an object, lifting off that object, bringing it back to a small bump behind their front teeth. This bump is called the papilla of the vomeronasal organ. Bears, like your cats and dogs at home, have two olfactory systems, the nasal epithelium and the vomeronasal system. The vomeronasal system identifies new scent. Nasal epithelium locates and later identifies scent as well. These behaviors in young bears were very exaggerated and very easy to observe. In adult bears, they're very subtle and very hard to observe. So I was fortunate to see the behavior associated with smell. I followed several of these bears into adulthood. One of them was a bear named Yoda who lived for 5.5 years and raised one set of cubs. But the main bear that I've worked with is this bear. Her name is Squirty. Squirty came to me as a 3-pound cub. I walked her loose in the forest, and when she became of age, I put a telemetry collar on her and followed her into the forest as she established her own home range. And as she expanded her home range, she'd drop a daughter into the expanded area, and the daughters would do the same. So now Squirty controls a greater home range that she shares with a number of adult daughters and granddaughters. Squirty in January will be 24 years old and giving birth to her 12th litter of cubs. She's given me a window into the world of the bears, not only through herself, but through her daughters and all the wild bears she interacts with, the males and other females. Squirty manages her social hierarchy. Let me get this pointer going. Squirty manages her family unit with a matrilinear hierarchy. Squirty is here in the middle. Her oldest daughter, SQ2, an adult granddaughter, SNLO, a younger daughter, Brooke, another adult granddaughter, 2, and the subadult, SQ2LO. Squirty on sight will chase all the bears below her in the hierarchy. And it's linear because the number 2 female chases all the bears below her, the number 3 chases everybody below her, and everybody chases SQ2LO. The result of this hierarchy is that in a marginal food year, Squirty will have access to the highest quality foods in the greater home range. It ensures that at least one of these females will be able to reproduce even if there's not much food around. In a good food year, all the females that are ready to reproduce will reproduce. But the second thing it does, it gives a place for these subadult females to stay even if there isn't an open home range. Now, if there was an open home range for them, they would give birth for the first time at age 3. But because they're being chased, that might be delayed to age 4, 5, 6, or in one case even 7 years. So the bears have a mechanism to manage their populations based on a natural food supply. Now, I emphasize natural food supply because the bears' food supply is anything but natural. The amount of human foods that enter the food chain is tremendous. Not only our birdseed, our unsecured garbage, our dumpsters, our landfills, our agricultural crops, cornfields and the like, and even logging increases the number of female home ranges the landscape can support. Oops, going the wrong way. The young males that came into these female home ranges and subadult males were chased out. In this series of photos, Squirty's going after her grandson. I watched this little guy get chased more than 30 times, not only by his grandmother, but by his mother, by his aunts, and any other bear who could get a target on him. By September of his second year, he left the greater home range and joined the population of male bears in the upper valley. Oh, I'm still going the wrong way. This is SQ2LO as an adult chasing a male bear out of my study site. It's one of the things all females cooperated on was chasing males out of their home ranges. And if you wonder why the males ever got anything to eat, it was because they were persistent and they would keep coming back regardless of the pressure. The large males that came into my study site came in during the breeding season, and I'll take a moment to explain my study site. It's on a piece of property that Debbie and I own. It's 400 acres surrounded by 65,000 contiguous acres. I go up there every day from the time the snow leaves in the spring until it returns in the fall, and I provide a small food reward to any bear that shows up. Some nights no bears show up, and some nights quite a few bears show up. I've been gathering social interactions between bears. As I said, in 2015, I got my PhD at Drexel University, and to publish today, you need quantitative data. And I've collected more than 1,500 observations of social interactions, which is the basis of what I'll be talking about tonight. These large males would hang around after the breeding season, and because of their size, they would take food from whoever they wanted. These are the 300-pound plus animals that do all the mating. This series of photos, Squirty is going after, weighing about 170 pounds, is going after a 300-pound male and asking him to leave. The females tolerated the males only so long, and before they asked him to leave, I watched her daughter, SQ2. She weighed only 150 pounds. She did a very exaggerated, stiff-legged walk in front of a 350-pound male. He backed off into the bushes like it was no big deal, but in the morning he was gone and he never returned. This suggests that there's a degree of female choice in mating, because if there wasn't a repercussion, these large males would stay and compete with the females in the female home ranges. Well, still on the wrong side. The big surprise in my study was there was a number of unrelated females that had access to Squirty's surplus, and they were all relatives of this bear, a bear we called Moose. And the year I put Squirty into the forest when she was with her two siblings when she was 17 months old, I walked her to the top of the ridge, and based on the experience I had with the first two cubs I raised, I knew that she would interact with wild bears, and I figured that the best place to find them was up on the hill. The cubs marked all the way up to the top of the ridge, and they marked all the way back to their cage following back, And in the morning, when I went out, they were on top of the ridge. I went up to see what was going on. Usually I had my telemetry gear with me. I could tell how far away they were by reducing the gain, and when I got close enough, I called them, and normally they would just run up to me. On this day, they ran from me, and I suspected they were with another bear. So the next morning, I changed my plan. They were feeding in a beach stand, and so I snuck in. I got the wind right. I was doing a pretty good job, but the leaf duff was thick. I broke a stick, and my two cubs ran and treed up the top of a large red maple tree. They were making an undulating moan, a nervous moan, and this wild female came over and false charged me. She defended my cubs from me, and I represented the most dangerous animal in the forest. And this was very early in my study, and I said, what's going on here? Here's a solitary animal. Why is she risking her life to defend my cubs that I knew weren't related to her? And finally, my scent got up to my cubs. They changed their moan to a moan of recognition. They climbed down out of the tree and came over and greeted me, as bears do, nose to nose. And then they pinned their ears and bit me on my forearms, punishing me for interfering with their time with this wild female. And after the punishment, then they reconciled. They dropped to my feet and went into a soft, repetitive moan of reconciliation. And this is very early in my study, and none of this made any sense in terms of a solitary animal. And so these female bears, Squirty, ever since that time, has allowed Moose and all her female relatives access to all of her surplus, including the study site. Squirty controls the bears that come into the study site. If they don't have her okay, she's the dominant female in the area, they don't come. And Squirty allows Moose and all her female relatives in, and she shows less aggression towards the unrelated females than she does her own daughters. And here I saw a huge parallel with human behavior. Because after all, we're much harsher on our family members than we are on strangers. And the reason we're harsh on our family members is they're our closest cooperators. And communication with them is terribly important. Unfortunately, how we communicate is not always pretty, but we can get away with it because we can always reconcile with a family member. But you'd never go up to a stranger and rank them out the same way you would a family member, because strangers are also cooperators, and you might not be able to reconcile with a stranger. So to see this behavior in a black bear, an animal that represents a human that lived millions of years ago, was truly remarkable. And I realized that, here's an animal that can teach us more about ourselves than probably any other animal on Earth. And the science has said that there are no non-human animals that practice this type of behavior. And they say that they can't because they don't have language and they can't have a social contract. And I found that not only can they have and keep a social contract, one of Squirty's daughters, Squirty adopted one of her granddaughters, and it was a deal made in one night. The adoption was, and it was enforced by both mothers over the ensuing year. And that's a pretty complex social contract. Still going the wrong way. Male social behavior was much harder to figure out than females. Female home ranges are 3 to 15 square miles. The male annual home ranges can be as much as 200 square miles. Initially I tried radio collars, but they'd disappear over a mountain and I'd have to track them with automobiles and airplanes, and I didn't learn very much. I just spent a lot of time trying to find them. But finally I realized there was a lot of extra sign or evidence of bears in some of the female home ranges, especially in clear cuts in the summertime where there were berries and insects. So I started monitoring the number of bears with cameras baited with a small amount of corn. And as soon as the corn was cleaned up, I would replace it. I had 2 cameras. I took lots of pictures before I made any sense of it, but finally in 2008, I had a clear cut that was 16 years old, right at the end of its productivity. I put out my 2 cameras. I got my 8 or 10 different males. And in 2009, the only bear there was the resident female. The males had all moved on to another area of surplus. But the big surprise was there was often two male bears sharing that small amount of corn. I knew one male could eat 3 gallons of corn and there was only a gallon there. And here I realized that these bears were friends. They were male coalitions. They weren't brothers like many people thought they might be. I'd done the DNA of the bears in my study area. We collected hair samples with hair snares. We had the UNH Genome Lab do the pedigree on the bears, and the male population was genetically unrelated. So this behavior was what's called mutualism, because they benefited at the same time. There was no time delay, but because it was between strangers, it was still just as interesting. As humans, we exhibit both reciprocal altruism and mutualism. We have gangs of guys that go out and drink beer and benefit equally, and we have gangs of women that go out and go shopping and do equally as well. All of this is about the access to, in the spring of the year, the bears are eating what I call emerging growth, especially in a year like this past year where there were no leftover beech nuts or acorns. They were feeding on the new growth of the plants. When the nutrients are readily available, these cubs are climbing a red oak tree and eating the oak leaf starts of the tree when the buds first break into leaves. They're feeding on many different species of leaf starts at that time of the year. They're feeding on nodding sedge in the woodland trails. You can drive around the upper valley and see them feeding on the edges of agricultural fields. Because this spring food is high in protein but lacks fats and carbohydrates, these bears don't get fat on it, but they do very well. And there's very little social competition for food this time of year. And because of that, they pick the spring of the year for their mating season. The females come into estrus for the first time in the middle of May and continue on until the first week of July, which coincides with the berry season. The male and female bears spend 3 to 7 days together, and the result of that union is a 2-celled organism called a blastocyst. They're delayed implanters, so that blastocyst doesn't implant into the uterus until late November, early December. And then there's a short gestation period of 50 to 55 days. The cubs are born in the dead of winter, mid-January, weighing less than a pound. Their eyes are shut, their little ear flaps are down, and they continue to develop in their mother's fur and are unable to walk or climb until she emerges from the dens in early to mid-April. The first thing the mother bear will do is to build a nest at the bottom of a good climbing tree. She'll coach her cubs the very first time they attempt to climb. Instinctively they can climb, but they have to learn about rough bark, smooth bark, and the skinny end of a limb. She'll stay at that site for 3 to 4 weeks while the cubs get adept at following and climbing before she moves on to better feeding grounds. When she does, she'll go to a large pine or hemlock near water, trees I call babysitting trees. The cubs will continue to practice climbing and sleeping in the trees. The mother will sleep at the base of the tree. She'll radiate out to forage and feed. The cub's toenails are audible on the bark, so if anything gets after the cubs, she can return in a hurry to see what's going on. They'll continue to forage and feed in this fashion throughout the summer and fall. They'll den with her as yearlings, and in the spring, when the male bear shows up, the family unit will break up. The family breakup is rather abrupt. I'm still going the wrong way. It'll go from a tender scene like this, where Squirty's granddaughter is removing ticks from her yearling son. And a week later, she becomes Attila the Hun. This female bear chased her cub up the tree and out on a limb, and then she'd go all the way to the bottom of the tree, and every time her cub thought about coming down, she'd run back up the tree. I watched her run up that tree 9 times in 10 minutes. So if you ever wonder how powerful a bear is, try climbing into the apple tree in your backyard and see how you feel. Finally, the male bear shows up. This is Squirty's daughter SQ2 meeting her mate for the first time. You'll see that she's rather aggressive with him. She's been busy raising her cubs for the last 18 months. She doesn't know this big stranger very well. He's calm and collected. He's been out, he knows what to expect. He's been out don-wanting around. You'll see him opening and closing his mouth. He's expelling moist air from his lungs, picking up her condition of estrus and running it through his olfactory ability. You'll also see the size difference. It's called sexual dimorphism. The females put their extra energy into raising cubs, and the males get as big as they can so they can compete to mate. He pursues her and finally catches up with her and grabs her with his forepaws and bites her behind the neck. All of this aggression and the bite behind the neck helps stimulate the female to ovulate precisely at the time of mating, which ensures conception takes place. This first grasp only lasted a few minutes before she got away. There was another 20 minutes of pre-courtship behavior in my study site. There's a picture section in my book Out on a Limb that shows this at close range. They're standing bipedally and open mouth wrestling. It's pretty spectacular. And finally, he caught up with her again. And this time they hooked up. They literally hooked up. They were locked together for 45 minutes. And during that time, there was another female bear at my study site who walked by him 10 feet away, rubbernecking as to what was going on. Finally, they split up and disappeared into the forest. 85% of the black bear's diet is vegetative. Having said that, the remaining 10 to 15% is animal protein, and of the animal protein, 95% is insects, ants, bees, and grubs. Bears are not true predators. They're opportunistic predators, which means if they come across loose protein in the forest, they'll take advantage of it. They'll take a fledgling bird off a branch or a bird's nest. They'll take a deer fawn in the first week of life. Or if they find a dead fawn, they'll scavenge on it. Bears get blamed for being predators, but they don't respond to movement or sound in the forest like a coyote might. They're literally, they're more of an herbivore than we are. We're both omnivores, but they eat a lot less meat than we do. The summer habitat of the black bear is in moist-rich soils along rivers and streams. The Mink Brook Nature Area is prime summer habitat for black bears. It's full of jack-in-the-pulpit and jewelweed and several species of wild lettuce that the bears eat. It's not a surprise that they're in there because it is their summer habitat, and it's some of the best riparian area in the Upper Valley. So if you think you want them out of there, they're never going to be out of there because there's lots of natural food in that area. Bears, this bear is feeding on jack-in-the-pulpit. It's the summer habitat of the black bear that bring people and bears close together. After all, we settled in the valleys for those same rich soils. It's not unusual in New Hampshire for somebody to have a nicely mowed lawn leading up to an old orchard, and with maybe 3 feet of vegetation. A black bear could be happily feeding on jack-in-the-pulpit, and you'd never know it. You'd never know it unless you went out there and saw the stumpled trails and occasional divot with the white roots growing into it. You'd never know it unless the bear stuck its nose up in the air and smelled black oil sunflower seed. Black oil sunflower seed has 3 times the calories per unit of any of their natural foods. So in a year like this past spring where there was no beech nuts or acorns, it was more than 10 times. Bears prioritize their food by the quality of food, the quantity of food, and the amount of risk that it takes to get the food. So the average black bear needs to put on 30% of its body weight in fat to get through the winter. They store fat for that purpose. A female black bear giving birth to cubs needs to put on 50% of her body weight in fat to get through the winter, give birth to cubs, and have reserves for the early spring. So if you want to understand why bears act the way they do around food, just think about how we act around money. After all, we store our money in a bank like bears store fat. We put it there for our retirement, to put our kids through school, or to buy a fancy toy. And you wouldn't go home in the evening and spread $100 bills all over your property and have the expectation that nobody would pick any of them up. And that's the same expectation we have when we have food attractants in our yard and the bears come in to get birdseed on our deck, and we can't imagine why he would have the nerve to be on our deck. The natural foods that the bears eat to put on the fat to reproduce and get through the winter are in New Hampshire are red oak acorns and beech nuts. Bears use a number of different types of dens. In this picture, I'm crawling out of a den that Yoda used as her maternal den and a den with her yearlings. It was under a root mass of a tree that had blown over many years before. When I crawled into the den and looked up, the ceiling of the den was a matrix of live roots that prevented the soils from collapsing down around her and her cubs during the winter time. This bear had a different strategy. This is what we call an open ground nest. These are usually butted up against a tree or a down log. They're often in dense softwood regeneration or blowdowns. So the bears have early warning. We have a cooperative project with New Hampshire Fish and Game where we keep GPS collars on 10 wild females. We've had a number of females that had these kinds of dens, and we took them out of our study because the risk of approaching these bears without having them run was too great. They also use rock dens. These rock dens are the base of ledges, and the bear can get into a den entrance that's not much larger than its head. Their shoulders are very supple, their back is very flexible, and they can wiggle down into the rocks into places we can't get. We often get to dens and we can even see a bear, maybe even sedate a bear, but can't get him out. We've thought about designing the perfect UNH student that was skinny, strong, and flexible, that we could lower down by his bootstraps and grab onto these bears and pull them out. But so far that project hasn't worked very well. So these rock dens have been a bit of a problem for us, but some of them work out all right. Here's the yearling bear with its mother in a rock den. And the last type of den I'll talk about are tree dens. These are, when a tree gets to be about 3 feet in diameter, the center of the tree can decay and rot out, leaving a huge cavity. This particular den was outside of a new residential area in Lyme. And one morning early in April, I got a call from a woman. She said she had a bear in her tree. And I got there, and sure enough, there was a bear in her tree. I informed her the bear had been in her tree all winter long. With this complex social behavior, you'd expect complex communication, and the bears have it. In this picture, Squirty is opening and closing her mouth, expelling that moist air from her lungs, picking up scent out of the airwaves. One of the first things I discovered about the cubs was that all the green vegetation they came across went into their mouth, and they'd just hold a leaf in their mouth for a few seconds and let it go undamaged. I called the behavior mouthing. I hadn't seen it in any other mammal before. I had some Brittany Spaniels at the time, so I stuck leaves in their mouths, and they weren't very impressed. I put leaves in my own mouth, and no bells and whistles went off. So I started learning all the different types of plants that were going in the cub's mouth and documenting what ultimately happened to them. And over the course of the summer, the cubs identified 125 different food items and rejected many, many more. I determined a bear could tell if a plant were edible or not simply by holding it in its mouth for a few seconds. I discovered that the bears had an accessory organ to their vomer or nasal system. Typically a vomer or nasal system, which is in cats, dogs, and snakes and other animals, picks up large molecules of scent with saliva, but the bear's accessory organ allows them to identify light molecules or airborne molecules. And so they have a great advantage over other types of mammals. I wanted to know more about this, so I got a hold of a roadkill bear and did some rather crude dissection. I found that there was a pocket in a V-shaped bone under the nasal septum. The bone's called the vomer. And there was a large fleshy organ in this pocket. There was a sensory nerve going down to the roof of the mouth that explained the mouthing behavior. And then there was a bundle of sensory nerves that went up the vomer, under the brain, and spread out over the roof of the throat. And the bear, all the scent that came in through the bear's nose and mouth passed over this region, and they were able to get a reading on. And only the true bears have this. The panda does not. And I found that all the true bears have no long-range vocalizations, and all the animals that lack it all have long-range vocalizations. Bears have emotional expression, which is generally honest. All social animals must know something about the mood of the animals around them. And emotional expression is facial expression, body language, intonation of voice, intensity of voice. And as humans, we have more facial expressions than any mammal on Earth. We have over 3,000 muscles in our face devoted to expression. We wouldn't be able to meet in this room if we weren't comfortable with the emotional state of everybody else in this room. And that's written all over our face. Right now, everybody in this room has a neutral look on their face, something I call subway face. Anywhere in the world you ride on a subway, you'll see that expression. But if somebody were up to something in this room, he or she would make us all uncomfortable. We'd all know who it was. We wouldn't know why, but we would all be nervous about it. A few years ago, when the Boston bombing took place, they caught the perpetrators by reviewing video looking for something out of place. And they caught these two guys trying to walk casually away while everybody else was horrified. In this picture, Squirty has just put her cubs up a tree at weaning time. She has an aggravated look on her face. She has eye expression, eyebrow expression, general facial expression, and ear expression. When a bear's ears are pinned, they're like a horse or a deer, and they have many ear positions in between. In this picture, Squirty has a happy face. Now, I get told bear stories by lots of people. I often ask them what the bear looked like. The answer I always get, it was black. Bears also have the expression of intention. And I get in a little bit of trouble with some scientists because they believe that only humans can have intention, that it's involved with language and so forth. But I believe that bears, because they on a regular basis communicate with strangers as we do, that intention is important. And they need to be able to read a stranger when they meet it. So when bears communicate with intention, they mechanically generate sounds and actions. So now they chomp their teeth, they huff, they swat, they false charge, they make the guttural sound the male was in the earlier video, that oh, which is a negative connotation. And the meaning of these sounds and actions depends on the context of the situation at the time. So even though they're limited in how they communicate, it's greatly broadened with context. So let's say you're walking on the Mink Book Trail, and it's a quiet day, and you run across the bear who was out there having a nice day with her cubs, didn't expect any danger or problems, and you come along. She might rush towards you, swat the ground, expel a big blast of air. Your bodily fluids might run a little bit. But she sees you as the aggressor. She thinks you're going to attack her and her cubs. And she's trying to delay confrontation long enough for communication to take place. I've been in close quarters with sows and cubs more than 30 times, and I've been false charged, I've been circled, and when they circle you, they want to know who you are. They want to smell your scent so they can keep in track of you. But if you hold your ground, stand strong, keep your eyes on them, and talk softly to them with an appeasement tone like you might talk to a child or a dog, in 3 to 5 minutes, they're going to see that you're not a threat, and you can safely walk away. And I had a bear cross in front of me in Orford one year. It was a sow with 3 cubs. I wanted to go in and see what was going on. And I went in. She was up a babysitting tree with her cubs. She false charged me. She circled me. She went back to her cubs, and I stood there and talked to her. 3 to 5 minutes, she could care less. I spent 2.5 hours filming her after being false charged and circled. And female bears are female black bears are very predictable. Female grizzly, on the other hand, is another story. The female grizzly can't hide, doesn't have trees to go up, so it's a good offense is the grizzly's best defense, and that's why it's advisable to use pepper spray when you're out in the national parks and stuff. Because the female bear may run at you heavily, breathing hard, and it gets in their lungs and stops them. But black bears, they're predictable. As I say, every time I've been able to see what's going on. Most of the time, they never false charge. Most of the time, they hide while their cubs are up a tree. Whoop. This is a video of Squirty false charging, and the context is the last film, the National Geographic documentary they did on my work, A Man Among Bears. The film crew showed up and thought they'd filmed Squirty for 8 hours. Squirty showed up and thought 35 minutes was more than enough, and this is Squirty telling the film crew to pack their bags and go home in no uncertain terms. I filmed this shot with a handheld video camera 10 feet away from her. Now, I've been false charged thousands of times, so you won't see the image jump very much. Squirty thought about what was going on. She thought about the message she wanted to deliver. Her face got long. She delivered her blow. She went back to a relaxed position, chomped a few times, and then waited for us to leave. And the message was simple. And you know, when I'm in the forest with Squirty, I'm taking her time. I'm using up time she needs to survive. At some point, she's going to ask me to leave, and she does that by false charging. And sometimes it's a simple bow. I remember Forrest Hammond was reviewing some video of mine one time, and on the video I said, "All right, Squirty, I'm leaving." And he said, "What'd you see? What'd you see?" I saw her eyes twitch. When bears think about doing something, their eyes twitch. The next thing she would have done is false charge, but it would have been a modest one. This one was fairly aggressive because there were strangers there. Now, oops. This is Squirty's granddaughter, Wanda. Wanda's got young cubs up the tree, and Wanda likes to false charge. She's probably false charged me more than any other bear, but she's not quite as believable as Squirty is. And you'll see the difference in intensity. And then she walked right up to me. This next video is again of Wanda. She has 2 young cubs in May. I use this in my thesis about communication and intention. And female bears manage their cubs with gulps, which are chirps, which are in syntax with body language. So if a female wants her cubs to tree, she'll run towards the tree, gulping with the intensity reflecting how much danger there is. The cubs will run out ahead of her. They'll run up the tree. She'll run up behind them and sit between them and danger. She wants them to come down. She'll sit at the base of the tree and gulp. They'll come down. She wants them to follow her off in a certain direction. She'll walk in that direction, gulping, and they'll follow in behind her. So it's actually syntax because it's using both 2 means of communication, a gulp and body language. But the thing is, the cubs aren't born knowing this. She has to teach them the meaning of the gulps and grunts and the body language. I raised cubs, I gulped and grunted, and it didn't do any good. And I didn't have 24/7 to work on it. So here's Wanda. She knows another bear is approaching. She's alert to it. She smelled it, and she's trying to communicate to her cubs that there's danger. So she starts gulping and chirping. She's alert to the other bear, and the cubs are oblivious. She gestures to them to follow her, and the cubs don't have a clue. She walks off expecting them to follow her away, and the cubs don't have a clue. She recognizes they're not behind her. She comes back, and the intensity of her gulps and chirps increases. And the cubs don't have a clue. She continues to gesture, even demonstrating what she wants. The cubs don't have a clue. Tries to push them up the tree. They still don't know what's going on. She's getting more and more anxious, increasing intensity. And it's not until the other bear is in sight do the cubs react. She goes up behind him, enforcing it, and when she starts to chomp, the other bear is underneath the tree that she's up. Now, the good thing about bears is they have real dangers in their life, and human parents face the same problem of unknown dangers and have a very hard time educating their children as to what these dangers are. Most of them come in a little cell phone today or a computer. And it's very hard to convince a kid that that thing that's so much fun to play with is as dangerous as it actually is. But in the bear's world, there's always something that shows up that reinforces the communication that the mother's trying to teach. And by the end of the summer, these cubs will respond to every chirp and grunt that she makes and be following in line. Bears mark for a number of different reasons, but the most important reason is to find their mates during the mating season. If a male bear hasn't already found the female that he wants to mate with, or the male that showed up isn't the male that she wants, she goes out and looks for him. The males will advertise on these red pine trees, which are the primary mark tree in the forest. The male bear will back up to the tree, flex his knees, and rub the porous the sebaceous oils in his fur into the porous bark of a tree. He'll rotate and bite the tree. When he bites the tree, he's releasing the aromatic compounds of the tree, which will often attract other bears to his mark. The sebaceous oil are large molecules of scent that are long-lasting with very little smell, so they have to advertise. So all the telephone poles you see bit, or your favorite cabin that has bites on the corners, that's all marking to attract other bears. I'm still going the wrong, not having a good night. Here's a 350-pound male traveling with a female, marking, letting other bears know that she's been taken. Now, a few years ago, starting in 2008, I started working with another kind of bear. I was invited to China to help them with the reintroduction of captively bred pandas, and I was asked to give a presentation. I went with a delegation of scientists who were talking about and studying the effects of climate change on panda habitat. Pandas are very susceptible to warm temperatures, and they move up and down the elevations to get to the temperate area they like the most. I was the last speaker, and I gave a talk very much like this one. And when I got done, Hu Rong, who's the director of science and research at the Chengdu Panda Base, came up to me and she said, "We noticed your talk was quite a lot different from the other talks." And she said, "You make us think." And the next day I was off to the Department of Forestry, where I gave the talk again. Everybody was very excited. I went home and didn't hear anything for 4 years, and I thought they had forgotten about their program. And then I got contacted again and asked to come back and give another talk. And they were concerned about a couple of things. They were concerned that if they tried to walk their pandas like I walk black bears, the pandas would run off and they'd lose a panda. And pandas are an icon in China. They're very valuable to them. They're a tourist attraction and industry. They lease them to zoos for $1 million a year, and it would be a great sense of shame if they lost one. So I told them the best thing to do would be to come to New Hampshire and see what we did. And the second concern they had was if they had a panda like Squirty, that the wild pandas would come and attack them, and it would be too dangerous to be out there. So we invited them to New Hampshire. They were coming to the English Learning Center at Drexel. They came up for a 4-day weekend. I had 6 cubs at the time that we could walk. And we opened up the enclosure. The cubs followed us out. We went up on the mountain behind the house. The cubs found new vegetation. They found a hornet's nest. We took them to a bare mark tree, red pine, and it was right after the breeding season. There was still scent on it. The cubs all climbed the tree, got very excited. They came off and they did a funny stiff-legged walk and marked with urine. And Hurong exclaimed they could communicate with the wild bears without even meeting them. She got very excited. That evening we went up to my study site and Squirty came out and several wild bears, and no bears attacked the truck. They got even more excited. They had a 7-hour drive back to Philadelphia. They talked the entire way back. And the following March we had the first pandas for our panda reintroduction program. Now the program is going very slowly. I wish things moved as fast as they did when I did my black bear work. But one of the reasons you do work like this is to find out what problems you're going to encounter in the future. And we're encountering problems, and so you can solve the problems and move on. Things don't work very fast in China. They don't like problems, and we're very slowly solving problems. And eventually we'll get there, but they got to do it on China time. So we're moving forward. I would like to take a moment now, George isn't going to like this, but to recognize a friend of mine and mentor since when I first started working with black bears. I wrote him and he was very nice to write back. George Schaller is sitting, he'll wave to you. George did the first studies on the pandas in the 80s and wrote a book, The Pandas of Oolong, and then I'm not going to think of the title of the other book right now. The Last Panda, yeah. And George has been instrumental in bringing the pandas to the recognition of the world. And he's highly revered in China. He's also done studies on mountain gorillas and tigers and lions, and we're really lucky to have him here in the Upper Valley. The story of our work in China has been told with the IMAX movie Pandas. Debbie has copies of that for sale if you've missed it in the theaters. It's really a very nice story. I liked it in the movie theater because there's a scene where I'm with my black bear cubs at a vernal pool. The cubs are swimming around, and the camera's of such high definition and in 3D. The mosquitoes come right out into the audience, and the audience is swatting mosquitoes while they're watching the film. And so it was pretty special to see that. Now I'm going to go on to a little bit about Mink. This is Mink in central Vermont on her travels. Mink is your local bear who was relocated to northern New Hampshire. She made almost a year's journey to return to Hanover. She's here. She's in her winter den. She's been in the neighborhoods all summer long, but barely been seen. She hasn't been in around houses. She's been spotted a couple times. There are plenty of open dumpsters where she has had access to food, but she's fed on a lot of natural food. And we'll see what happens when she has cubs in the spring. Here's a couple days of her travels. This was in September, and she was in Lyme, almost home, but that was 5 or 6 months before she finally got home. She went all the way to Castleton, Vermont on the New York border, and then came back and denned in Pomfret, Vermont. Here's her winter den, and we thought, she was traveling 30 miles a day, we thought she'd be a bag of bones. She was a nice healthy bear weighing about 160 pounds in her winter den, which is an average weight of a female. So we've learned a lot from that. Even though it was difficult for her, her cubs were removed because we felt that if she was relocated with her cubs all would have been run over, and we would have lost 5 bears instead of just 1. But we learned that she knew how to navigate human infrastructure. When she started traveling south, she'd travel along the interstate and not cross until she found an underpass, and then she'd go under the underpass. And then eventually she was crossing roads regularly, but she was crossing at low traffic times, so she's crossing at 1 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the morning. And we were getting 24 points a day on her, so we're getting good data. Eventually I'll be able to write it all up. And to end up tonight, I have a quick visual. It's Houdini's apple tree gymnastics, so hang on. Finally, is dismount. Thank you very much. Got questions? We got time for a few questions if anybody has them. Yes.
What have you been able to determine is the reason why there was no food crops over the last year? Was it from some insect infestation?
No. This happened about 14 years ago, same thing. And oak trees have acorns 4 out of 5 years generally, and then 1 year without. And beech nuts have produced every other year. And when the sun, the moon, and the stars line up, there aren't any fall crops. Wow. And that, again, every 14 years or so that'll happen. Now, some scientists believe the trees do it on purpose, so their seeds have a chance, and it kills off all the mice and the rodents. And as you remember, last year, all the gray squirrels ran off and committed suicide. They're all over the highways in Vermont.
One other follow-up. When the bears, the native population of bears, suffer through that kind of shortage or scarcity, do you see a corresponding rise in bears venturing into more populated areas to go after?
Yeah, we definitely do. When I said the quality food, quantity food, and risk. So when there's no food, they take much greater risks, and that risk is coming in around people. So there's a lot. And in years when there's no natural food, people think the bear population suddenly tripled. And when there's plenty of natural food, they wonder where all the bears went. So we're not very informed. We don't pay attention to the natural cycle and the effects of food on the population. Yes?
How do the bears know when they're asked to leave? Why do they run like that? Have they had an experience of violence by the bears that are asking the other bears to leave? Like when the female bears are chasing the bears off?
The question was, how do bears know to leave when one bear chases another bear? Well, dominance belongs to the dominant. You know, if you want to be dominant over somebody, you act dominant. And Squirty is the dominant female, and by chasing another bear, they run. Her message to him is, I'm bigger and stronger, and she probably is. She probably swept on all of them. So it's a dominance hierarchy based on personality. Squirty was a dominant bear from a cub. When she was a tiny cub, she chased her sister off, who wasn't quite as dominant. And Squirty's daughters have all been, one year she had 3 daughters. The dominant daughter chased off the other more subordinate daughters. Yes?
How much land is Squirty on, including her daughter and her granddaughters? How much land does that encompass?
It's probably, well, home ranges is everywhere they go in a year, but it's probably 20 square miles. But there's other unrelated females that overlap.
Is that in Lyme? Is that where it is?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the 4 generations are in that.
Yeah, and all females develop those little dynasties because they keep the daughters are more important to them than sons.
And I just have one more question. How many tagged bears do you have? Collar bears?
Right now we're down to 3. We try to keep 10. But I've had my knees done, and I was a little slow at catching some more. But we lose them in hunting seasons and different reasons. So.
Don't they know not to shoot collared bears?
People are people. Got any questions up there?
Are the bears den for the season now?
What's that? Are they den for the season? The bred females are den. Some of the females with cubs, but the males are still out. Males will be out as long as they can get food. and there's not much snow. Temperatures won't bother them. Up behind you.
Are there any chances for like high school students to work with you, or the
Well, we don't have much opportunity. We have occasionally had interns, but it depends on the skill that they bring to the table. And because these bears all have to go to the wild, we have to limit human contact. I just tell people to, send in a letter saying what their skills are, and I'll put it on file, but there's never any guarantees. I get lots of requests, but many people just want to go hug a bear, and we're not there for that. Yes?
Do you still have Mink's 3 or 4 cubs from
We raised Mink's cubs. We released them this spring. The total cubs we had over the winter was 82 cubs. Of those cubs, we only have had reports of 5 killed in the hunting season, which is extraordinarily good. None of Mink's cubs have been.
So they're all collared?
They're not collared, they have ear tags, so if something happens to them, we'll know what happened to them. But so far, they're all still alive, yes.
That little girl has a question for you.
Oh, this little girl.
How can you tell female bear from a male bear?
Her question is, how do you tell a female bear from a male bear? Female bears are short. They're typically no more than 60 inches tip of nose to tip of tail. They have a special marking hair that comes out below their tail. It's much longer than the other hairs, so you can spot that. The males have the same marking hair, but it's down between their legs. Male bears, probably anything over around here, over 160 to 200 pounds is a male. They can be up to 96 inches in length. The big males are 300 plus pounds. And when it comes down to how I tell, they're as different as male and female humans. If we didn't have any hair, we could still tell by our facial features who was a male and who was a female.
Thank you so much, Ben.